Dear friends, hello everyone. This is a new video on my channel, and if you want to see the sequel as soon as possible, then give it a like and write about it in the comments. Here is a guy who was lucky enough to be in this video. If you also want to get a chance to be in the next video, then write something in the comments. I wish you all an enjoyable viewing experience. Bloody fog, a huge amount of blood. That's what the main character saw in front of him. Comrades who begged him to escape from this battlefield, and those who even in the last minutes of their lives believed that humanity can survive. But in the end, at the very end, the protagonist was left alone. In front of him was an incredible number of strong enemies, and their leader was surprised that the protagonist was called a human god, because he looked like a real weakling. Heavenly Demon Emperor looked at the man with his creepy look and said that the god of pills cannot win. The main character's name was Qin Feng, and he was a complete zero in martial arts. With tears in his eyes, the hero confessed that he had lived for 100,000 years and had not even studied martial arts. He began to approach the enemy saying that he only had to keep fighting. The hero instantly took a pill, causing his body to emit energy, and he instantly went to fight, realizing that this would be his last battle. The protagonist pounced on one of the enemies, after which his body was instantly pierced by the hand of the creepy creature. Falling to the ground, the guy reflected on the fact that his body was talentless in martial arts, but he was an incredible alchemist. He promised himself that if he had a second chance, he would definitely do things differently. Suddenly he opened his eyes and was surprised, for he didn't realize what was happening now. He looked to the side and didn't realize where he was. He took the jade medallion in his hands, and then memories came rushing into his head, causing him to suffer a bit. The protagonist remembered this terrible day, because today was the day Lin Shuan had made the protagonist unable to learn martial arts. Then the protagonist won the competition and did not understand why his fiancée copyrightee wanted to kill him. She said that she had made a marriage contract only to temporarily join the Qin family. Then she grabbed the protagonist's face and with a haughty expression surprised that a weak man like the protagonist thought he would be worthy to be by her side. Then there was a lot of pain and disappointment in the protagonist's eyes. It was then that the hero's martial arts were destroyed and he focused on alchemy, reaching the peak of that field. But even so, he now realized that it was far from enough. He decided that he would save the world himself. He looked at the pendant and was glad that thanks to it he had a chance to start over. He got dressed and decided to focus on getting stronger. Now he was determined to reach the top. Suddenly, a man appeared, shouting that their business was not good at all. He said that the eldest son of the Lin family had invaded the medical garden and wanted to see the protagonist. The guy remembered the past in which this man showed up and humiliated the protagonist in public and took the medical garden for himself. The protagonist asked to bring him to that guy. At that time, inside the medical garden, with a haughty look, he shouted for the protagonist to come as soon as possible and bragged about his sister's success in martial arts. The hero arrived at the place and began to mock the man, who was hiding behind his younger sister. The guy didn't expect such a thing and was shocked. The protagonist began to explain that once they broke the prenuptial agreement, this garden can't belong to them. Then the protagonist looked at the man with contempt in his eyes and said that it was wrong of him to come here. The guy was angry. He couldn't even think of what to say to him. He didn't understand why Feng had become so sarcastic. He started laughing at the hero again, saying that if it wasn't for his sister, he would have been killed long ago. He shouted that the protagonist had become ungrateful. Feng continued to laugh because even here the guy had attributed his younger sister. After that, the guards arrived and surrounded those shameless people. The guy was nervous. He did not understand what had happened to the protagonist, because before he had always been docile. He decided to remind that there was only a month left for the new alchemist competition. The hero indifferently asked what about it, while the guy offered a bet. He said that if the hero can win he will give the family iron mine, and if he loses he will give the garden. The hero's servant thought that their master was not stupid and would definitely not agree to such a stupid bet. At that time the hero said he agreed and offered to sign a written agreement. The servant was shocked that his young master agreed. The guy was very happy about this opportunity and said that the hero would not regret what he had done. They signed the papers, after which the guy with a great mood began to leave. The servant was already in a terrible state. He thought that they were finished, while the hero was full of confidence. because he devoted more than 100,000 years to alchemy, and was sure that the enemy will crawl on his knees. A little while later, the hero was sitting and meditating, his body covered in aura. Just as suddenly, he started coughing up blood violently. Qin Feng continued to smile, thinking that although his strength was at the bottom, he had a chance to regain his strength. Warriors had 6 realms, of which the Qi and Blood realm was the weakest, followed by the Tempering realm, the Main realm, the Void realm, the False God realm, and finally the Half-God realm. Each of the realms had 5 levels. At that time the hero couldn't raise them, but now he was able to maintain the foundation and he would be able to improve. The servant came running to the protagonist again, saying that something terrible had happened. The hero arrived at the garden where all the herbs had wilted, and soon it was time to collect the medicines. The hero realized that there was no way they would be able to grow new ones. Then he began to use the transformation technique, and his body began to be covered with aura. Energy continued to burst from the body of the protagonist. After his eyes began to shine brightly, thanks to this technique, the hero noticed that in the useful herbs hidden harmful plant, which is why everything just wilted. The protagonist realized that the guy was definitely involved in this, but the protagonist was not upset. He was happy and said out loud that it was a great gift. 10 days later, the herb gatherers arrived, and the protagonist didn't even come out to meet them. The servant was shaking with fear, and he said with his last strength that his master would arrive very soon. The protagonist greeted the guys, and said that even the Patuhi had not woken up yet, and they had already arrived. The guy talked about how the hero didn't kneel before the herb gatherer and showed his disrespect. The herb gatherer from the main branch was very angry and gave the protagonist one last chance and ordered him to kneel. The servant begged the man not to be angry. Everyone knelt down, while the protagonist continued to stand on his own 2 feet with his head proudly raised. The servant begged the master to fall on his knees, because otherwise they would be in trouble. At that time, the protagonist showed his middle finger and sent everyone away. This was something they definitely didn't expect, and the picker was enraged. The protagonist with a haughty voice started saying that the man was just a spoiled chicken, and that was the reason why he wasn't going to kneel before him. The man was incredibly angry at such insolence, and then asked if the hero had prepared any herbs before acting so arrogant. The hero said that there were plenty of herbs, and they were already ready for the man. The man was incredibly angry and increased the rate of herbs as much as 6 times, saying that if he could not fulfill this rate, he would lose his head. The servant was terrified. He realized that there was no way they would collect the required amount of herbs. At that time in the past, the picker had been favored by this guy, and made a bet with this man, namely that if Feng lost, the picker would get half of the garden. He imagined the protagonist was clueless about what to do, because all the grass was spoiled. The protagonist smiled, and told the guys to follow him. 2 people who thought they had already won this battle followed the protagonist. The guy looked at the grass that had wilted. Then a smile appeared on his face and he started laughing, while the picker was incredibly angry and was going to finish off the hero. The hero touched his sword and said that it's no wonder that scum can only see garbage, and they don't pay attention to the most important things. Then he showed a huge field sown with grasses, and said that the guys should look carefully. The herbs that grew on these fields looked just magnificent, which instantly amazed everyone present. They could not believe what was in front of their eyes. The enemy couldn't believe his eyes. He thought that Feng knew absolutely nothing about herbs, and here was such a picture. The collector was shocked even more because the quality of all these herbs was at an incredibly high level, and the quantity was 5 times more than necessary. While the servant was delighted with his master, and incredibly happy, the enemy was furious, and shouted that Feng couldn't have done something like this. At that time, the protagonist thought that the lian grass would actually cause other plants to die when planted near them, but in this era, no one knows that if the lian grass is modified, it will have an extremely positive effect on other plants. The protagonist with a haughty look reminded the enemy of the dispute between them, and that he must hand over the mine. The enemy said that he wasn't going to hand over anything. He seemed confident that Feng wouldn't do anything about it. At that time, the hero showed the document that signed this genius, and if he does not fulfill the agreement, he will go to prison, and for a long time. The enemy tried to seek help from the collector, but he turned away, not wanting to get involved in any way. The guy realized that he was in deep shit, so he lost consciousness. A little while later, The protagonist showed his servants their new mine, which was a gift from his dear brother Lon. The servant didn't know why they needed the mine, as their garden was much more valuable. But the hero said that he was a bit overzealous, which amazed the servant, who thought it was part of some plan. In fact, the hero remembered from his past life that this mine holds a lot of value, and he could take advantage of it. Suddenly a man started running towards the hero shouting that something had happened at the mine. He reported that the mine had suddenly collapsed, leaving dozens of miners trapped under the rubble. At that time, outside the mine, people gathered at the rubble-filled entrance and cried for their relatives who were inside at the time. The servant was shocked by what happened. He thought that God hated them since this happened as soon as they got this place. People started pointing fingers at the protagonist and blaming his family for what happened. The guards reacted instantly, while people were saying that everything was fine in the Lin family's hands. But the hero had angered the mountain god. The people were furious and asked for their fallen kin to be returned to them. The servant was very frightened and offered the protagonist to leave, but Feng strictly refused his subordinate. He thought that it could not be a coincidence. The protagonist started to use his technique and his body became covered in a golden aura. Meanwhile, inside the cave he found people who were still alive. The protagonist realized that it wasn't inside the mine, but someone had just blown up the entrance to the mine, and instantly looked with his cold gaze in the direction where Lin was standing and grinning. It seemed obvious that he was involved in what had just happened. The protagonist began to shout that the people inside the cave were still alive, and that if the stones at the entrance were removed, they could be saved. People were crying and were very angry. They didn't believe that anyone could survive the rubble. At that time Lin began to mock the hero, saying that he was talking nonsense. People continued to attack the guards. They wanted to kill the protagonist, and the subordinates begged the hero to leave. At that time the guy looked at everyone with a creepy look, then ordered the soldiers to stop resisting and lay down their weapons, which amazed everyone. After the protagonist began to say that the loved ones of these guys still have a chance to be saved, which instantly changed the views of these people. At that time, the protagonist shouted as confidently as possible that he guaranteed the rescue of people. He also added that people can do whatever they want if they find dead bodies during the excavation. The protagonist asked if the people would agree to this. They were silent and crying, and for a while they didn't know what to say. They whispered amongst themselves, and after a moment they all got to work trying to dig out the entrance to the mine. At that time the protagonist turned to his servant. The hero's request startled the servant. At that time the enemy was watching and laughing, as he was sure that the people would not succeed. It turns out that this scoundrel placed poison in the cave, and even if people did not fall they will die under the influence of this poison. 2 hours later, the girl yelled with all her might about what they had dug through. They instantly looked inside in search of their loved ones, but they saw a horrible picture, namely that their loved ones were lying unconscious and not moving. People instantly started screaming and crying. They thought the protagonist was a liar because people were dead. At that time, the enemy intervened and reminded the people of the main character's words, namely that people can do anything they want to him. The people were incredibly angry and wanted Feng to pay for the death of their loved ones with his life. The enemy was sure that the protagonist will not be able to prove that people were poisoned. Suddenly, the enemy was shocked that Feng remained as calm as possible, and was doing something. Feng ordered to shove some fruit into the people's mouths and force them to chew it. He ordered this poor servant to shove medicine mouth to mouth, which logically didn't please the kid, but he couldn't refuse. He began to perform this procedure on the bearded man. From such a picture people went crazy. How dare the hero so abuse the bodies of their loved ones? The protagonist ordered the servant to continue and not to be afraid of the people. The servant was crying, as he was sure that they would be killed for such a thing, and he gave his first kiss to the bearded man. Suddenly the man opened his eye. Then he was surprised that he was asleep and said that he had a long and very strange dream. Suddenly people were frightened because just now the dead had risen before their eyes. The man's family came to him and were incredibly happy that he had been saved. At that time the protagonist smugly said that it is not worth burying living people. It turns out that the hero is the only one who knew that there is an antidote against miasmas which poison people. The hero asked what the man remembered before he lost consciousness. He told that Lon blew up the entrance to the cave, then afraid that they could survive placed the poison. and tried to kill them. All the people who regained consciousness began to accuse the enemy of trying to kill them. The protagonist with a smile on his face said that he didn't expect that the guy was capable of such a thing, and then said that people are free to do what they want. They immediately surrounded these parasites, who were very much frightened, after which the screams of the guy and his charges were heard many kilometers away from the scene. A little while later, the protagonist went inside the mine, but could not find the item that was needed. At that time, the men thanked Feng for saving their lives. They all bowed before the protagonist and said they would never forget his kindness. The protagonist was very kind to these people and decided to give them a few days off. The men said they would do whatever Feng ordered from now on. The hero asked what they had done with the enemy, and the man said that they had surrounded him, but miraculously the guy managed to escape, but he was sure that now he had no place in the city. The servant asked if they would go home, since they had done all the work. At that time the protagonist got on his horse and asked if the servant knew about the moneylenders, and he said that they were terrible people who were better not to be messed with. He said that if you take a risk and borrow from them, and God forbid not to repay the debt in time, they will come and make you an invalid, and the interest rate is too high. The servant said that only fools would ask these people for money. The servant asked what it is the hero decided to ask, and the guy said that he borrowed 500 gold pieces from them. The servant thought that the Lord was joking because he certainly does not want to take the poor servant to the grave, but it was not a joke. The servant was just in shock and panic because a normal person for a year is enough only 20 gold pieces, and the hero borrowed as much as 500. The hero said that he needed the money to take good care of the medical garden. At that time the servant decided that this time they are definitely finished, because their garden can have a maximum of 100 gold at the moment. The protagonist had hoped to pay with the miraculous ore, but he couldn't find it, and now he doesn't know how to solve this issue. The servant shouted that they are finished, and now the only thing left for them is to sell their garden, in which case their whole family will be finished. Suddenly a man's voice was heard behind him. It turned out that it was his father, who was also very happy to meet his son. The servant was about to tell that the hero borrowed money, but Feng immediately stopped him and ordered him to shut up. The hero remembered that in his previous life his father had done everything for him, literally risking his life, and this time he was going to make things right. The father showed his son the pills he had spent a lot of money on. He hoped they would help restore his son's base. The protagonist began to say that his body is already much better and not to worry so much. He realized that for the sake of these 2 pills his father worked hard. Suddenly, the man grabbed his son's hand. He was surprised because the protagonist's chi had grown. At that time Feng said that they should discuss it at home. He told his father that he had found a teacher who would teach him alchemy, which amazed the man, because he could not imagine that his son would become an alchemist. And the hero said that the teacher considered him the most talented student. The father was indescribably happy for his son. He always thought his kid was a genius, and was sure that he could not stop him so easily. Then he instantly said that he wanted to meet this teacher. The hero said that his teacher does not like outsiders, and wishes to remain anonymous. His father understood the idea and said that it is not surprising for great people. The father said he would, and then told him that it was time for him to leave. Father held out the Qin family's battle order, then said that if there was a need, the hero could use it. The father said that even though they had not seen each other for a long time, and entrusted the family to his son, he stroked the protagonist's head, while Feng thought about the incredibly important thing his father had given him, and swore to himself that he would never let his father down. A few days later, the weather was beautiful outside, and another servant was heard shouting that someone had come to see the protagonist. While Feng was amazed that the time had come so quickly, the protagonist ordered all guards to be brought in and put on alert. The protagonist was approaching the gate, with thoughts that he was about to be finished as the period of debt repayment had expired. Feng ordered the soldiers who were on alert to open the gate. The protagonist closed his eyes and thought that he was ready to fight until the very end. At that time, the servant was surprised by who he saw. It was an incredibly cute and beautiful girl who came to thank the protagonist for saving her life. She said that she was a miner who was saved by the protagonist, and she came to see her future husband. The protagonist was a little embarrassed, then said that now the situation is clear. Suddenly he remembered a moment from the past, when he passed the medicine to this girl mouth to mouth, and worried whether he had not done something dirty. The protagonist asked how the girl was going to repay him for his kindness, She said she was ready to tell him where the wonderful ore was. The protagonist did not understand how the girl knew this information. The girl said that she had taken a detox pill and was conscious at the moment when the guys were hiding the ore, and was able to remember its location. The protagonist was shocked by what he heard. He didn't care about the ore. He was interested in the fact that the girl herself was able to prepare the pill. The girl was embarrassed and confessed that she had learned it from books. The protagonist was shocked. He realized that the girl had a great talent for alchemy. Feng asked her if she wanted to become an alchemist, and she confessed that she had a poor family to support, which was the reason why she worked in the mine. The protagonist promised that he would take care of her parents, and then said that all the girl needed was to become his apprentice and obey him in everything. In fact, the protagonist decided to take her because he wanted to spend more time on martial arts, and he could throw some of his worries on the girl. At that time, the girl understood everything a little differently and was very confused. She also promised to follow the protagonist. The protagonist was happy. The girl was also very happy. Feng thought he had found a great slave, while the girl thought she had found a great husband. A few days later, the protagonist decided to sell the ore to pay off his debts. The servant was incredibly shocked that they needed to sell the ore for 1,000 gold pieces, but he thought it was possible if they could find a buyer. At that time, the protagonist confessed that they needed to sell 10,000 gold worth of ores because he had miscalculated a bit. Everyone was shocked when they heard the amount because it was unrealistic to pay something like that. The protagonist said he would take care of it and asked them to trust him. In fact, the protagonist and the girl worked hard to improve the quality of the ore, even though they could do better, but the ore will definitely break up very quickly. Suddenly, the protagonist realized the gravity of the debt that he must pay, because the amount is really cosmic. As soon as the hero arrived at the largest shop, there the seller said that the pure ore looks like a jewel and this is some cobblestone. Feng called the buyer a dilettante, and said that this is really a wonderful ore, and the buyer promised that if this boulder turns out to be ore, he will bow at the feet of the hero. The owner of the place arrived and asked what all the noise was about. The merchant began to tell that a madman arrived to them, who claims that this cobblestone is a miraculous ore. As a result, the protagonist and his servant were kicked out of the store, saying that they don't accept fakes. The protagonist was furious because his precious ore was called fake, while the servant tried his best to stop his master. The protagonist thought that there was no need to be nervous, but he also realized that at this rate he would be late again. The owner of the store told the seller to just immediately throw out such customers, not even to dialogue with them. The man looked at the ore and called it coal, then looked at this and assumed that it was worthless. The seller told how Feng wanted to get as much as 10,000 gold coins for this junk. Suddenly the stone began to crackle right in the man's hands, after which it had a very bright glow and the owner was instantly enveloped by a very bright beam of light. The seller said that the charlatan tried such a cheap trick to get them to buy this junk. At that time the owner hit the seller with all his might and said that he had offended a very important person. The owner ordered the man to prepare the money. He was going to apologize to the protagonist because he considered him a very important person. The servant talked about how it was a total horror and just kicked him out. The protagonist said that the problem is not the price, but the people who do not know and simply cannot appreciate this masterpiece. At that time, the owner of the store ran to the protagonist with all his legs with the words that they are ready to buy out all the ore. Breathing heavily, the owner apologized for the way he behaved with the protagonist and said he would pay 10,000 gold. The protagonist smiled and said that the man knew about goods. The servants were also incredibly happy to have all the ore bought from them. The protagonist apologized to the man and said that he was not ready to sell the ore. The protagonist began to say that the seller had offended his friends, and for this reason he could not sell the man the ore, because it would be wrong. At that time, the servants could not believe what they heard, because they would be happy to sell the ore. The owner began to scold the subordinate, who justified his behavior by saying that Feng had brought a fake. The man said that usually the miraculous ore looks like a gem because of unnecessary impurities. He also said that the better the quality of the ore the brighter its light, and such a light he had never seen in his life. The servants were shocked that some black stones were so rare. The man was well aware that there was definitely some incredible alchemist behind the protagonist. The protagonist thought that since the man had realized the value of this ore, he should splurge. The protagonist, with a smirk on his face, recalled the seller's words that he would bow if the ore turned out to be genuine. The protagonist, with a smile on his face, said that something like that was definitely there, while the shopkeeper was very angry, and then hit the subordinate with all his might with the words that if he promised, he must fulfill the promise. The guy started to bow as promised. While the man asked the hero not to be angry and offered him 30,000 gold pieces, the hero agreed to a similar amount, and the man said that he hoped to cooperate in the future. The servants were in complete defeat after hearing how much Feng would get for the ore. The hero was incredibly happy because now they will not only pay off the debt, but on top of a very large amount will remain. After that, the guys with a great mood went shopping. The hero decided to buy a lot of things for the development of martial arts. A little while later, late at night, the boy told about how Feng had bullied him and begged for justice. He told his father that he had been beaten up because of the protagonist and asked for revenge. The father asked if it was true that Feng had dared to frame his son, and the boy said that it was true and asked his father for help. The father promised that Feng would not survive tomorrow, as what kind of father would allow his son to be bullied? At that time, the guy was incredibly happy. He was just waiting to see the protagonist perish. At that time, at the estate of the protagonist's family, Feng was practicing, after which his hands were covered with aura, and he was happy, because thanks to the pills that his father gave him, he was able to reach the 5th level of the first realm, namely the realm of Qi and blood. Suddenly, Feng heard some noise, after which he instantly used the divine sense technique. He instantly saw the unknown people who were hiding behind the wall. Feng was glad for this opportunity. After all, now was a great chance to test his new powers in practice. One of the men was talking about distracting the protagonist's attention, while the other was to kill him instantly. Suddenly Feng kicked his own door, which ruined the couple's plans. They were shocked by this turn of events. At that time, Feng said hello to them and asked them what exactly they were looking for in his house. He told them that he knew they had arrived before they entered, then confessed that he hadn't swung his fists in a long time, and went out to give the assassins a good welcome. They mocked the protagonist as he was only a level 5 Qi realm, and they had killed countless people and stronger. The hero hadn't really fought in all his 100,000 years, and was now anxious before his first time. The opponents taunted the protagonist, after which one of them prepared to fight and promised that Feng would pay for this lesson with his life. The protagonist was going to do it because he wanted to become stronger in the future. The opponent boasted that he was on the 8th level of the Qi realm, and that he had killed more than 80 people. His friend was surprised that he was using such strong skills to kill a scum like Feng. He immediately headed towards the protagonist, who was amazed at what the 8th level looked like. While the man was confident of his brother's instant victory, the hero was incredibly excited to fight for the first time in 100,000 years. Suddenly the protagonist's fist appeared in front of his opponent's face, and a moment later, the man found himself sealed into the ground at a tremendous speed. Everyone was shocked by this, and the hero was amazed because it seems that the opponent died from a single blow. The hero talked about how it wasn't his problem that the enemy couldn't even take one hit, while the man couldn't believe what he had just seen. The protagonist promised that he would try not to kill the man with a single blow to get a feel for the battle. At the time, he was incredibly scared and angry at the words he heard. After that, he instantly changed his face and said that he would avenge his brother, with whom he had been separated all his life. After that, he instantly started to run away at a great speed. It seemed that he had now developed a speed that he had never had in his life. The protagonist didn't mind. He was shocked that he was so strong at only the 5th level of the Qi realm. Feng thought of following the assassin and finding the fools who decided to kill him. At that time, near Feng's town mansion, the assassin disappeared. The hero arrived at this place, as he realized that this is where he was ordered. At that time, an unknown man with wounds begged for help, saying that he was going to be killed. He fell to the ground, and the hero assumed that the customer was getting rid of pawns. Suddenly there were people with torches who instantly surrounded the protagonist, and the most disturbing thing was that all the people were level 8 masters of the Qi realm. Suddenly, the same guy who said that the protagonist shouldn't have come to this place appeared. He was sure that Feng would definitely leave this world today, so he was smiling and confident. The protagonist was not surprised that the mysterious customer was this guy, and then the guy began to say that he did not understand about any killers. He only knows that the hero invaded his home. The protagonist was shocked that the guy dared to ask the city lord for help. Then the man took out a dagger from the corpse of the killer, then was surprised that the protagonist talked about him. He told the guy that if he wanted to kill someone he had to do it right, as he didn't want to wipe his ass all the time. The guy told his father that he really went overboard, while the hero was shocked that it was the guy's father. Turns out the man didn't care about what the protagonist's family had done for him and thought it was time to forget about it. Whereupon he ordered the hero to get rid of him. The guy was instantly twisted by two men. The man said that the protagonist's ex-wife was going to destroy the Qin family. He also started talking about how his family had a great future, unlike the protagonist's family. The guy was incredibly angry after saying that, while the son of the villain was happy and asked what his father would do, he said that he would use a legitimate reason. He was going to get rid of the protagonist and was smiling through his teeth. The main character was sitting in the cell and thinking about the fact that he was careless. He could not imagine that the city lord would do such a thing. Suddenly Feng heard strange noises. It turned out that it was Sancho, who snuck into the cell of the protagonist. He could not come when his master was taken under arrest. The servant couldn't believe that the protagonist had done such a stupid thing. While Feng didn't know what he was talking about, the servant told him about people talking about how after Feng found out that his ex-wife was marrying the prince, he went crazy and killed two members of the royal family. The protagonist was surprised at how well the city lord had decided to set him up. Feng thought that, with such an accusation, he might actually be executed. The servant suggested that the protagonist run away, because now was the time, while the guards were changing each other, and he dug a hole in the wall. The protagonist began to say that he was innocent and should not run away, while the servant tried to explain that they had no time at all and should run away as soon as possible. Feng said that he was a member of the Qin family, and he intended to handle this situation with dignity. Suddenly the voices of the guards were heard, and the hero instantly started pushing the servant to run away, and after a moment the passage was covered with straw, and the guards did not suspect anything. The protagonist looked at the family's seal and reflected that he didn't expect that the man his family had helped so much could do such a terrible thing. The protagonist pulled out the seal through the hole, and with the words that he had to go to extreme measures, the seal let out a flame that began to fly into the sky, and then the entire sky lit up with a flame with the name of the Qin clan on it. A moment later, a huge number of soldiers began to run into the place, after which they instantly killed the guards, then bowed to the protagonist and said that they were gathered. Feng said that nothing serious had happened, it was just that a certain person was relying too much on his father. The protagonist instantly told that the guards would need to deal with this person. Each of these people was a true martial arts master. A little while later, a servant was cheering up the guards with all his might, saying that their young master was very wise and he had definitely found a way out of this mess. They had faith in their master and approached the place of execution. People were pointing their fingers towards the gallows and saying that it was still morning and the man had already been hanged. It was true, and the corpse was really hanging on the rope, with no sign of life. The servant could not believe what he heard. He was shocked, angry, and saddened. The servant began to cry with all his might, and together with the guards to worship and ask forgiveness for what they had failed to do to the protagonist. Suddenly Feng greeted his servant and asked why he was crying. All the servants were amazed at what they had just seen, and then instantly went to hug the protagonist, happy that he was alive. Feng tried to push these fools away, as people were looking at them, while the servants continued to rejoice. The protagonist pointed his finger at the gallows, then said that the enemy's father was not as good as his. It turned out that none other than the city lord himself was weighing on the noose. The servant could not understand how the young lord managed to pull off something like that. At that time, the protagonist confessed that it was easy, and asked if the guy knew the thing he was holding in his hands. The servant was amazed at what he saw, because it was a battle order of the Qin family. The hero said that it was enough for the guards to see the sign, as they will instantly arrive and will unconditionally follow the order of the man who called them. The servant asked what order the protagonist had given. Feng was surprised that the servant had not guessed. The enemies dared to infringe on the protagonist's life. It was for this reason that the masters destroyed the city lord's mansion, after which they made his body experience hell. The protagonist was upset that his father had to work very hard to get this battle order, and now it's just nothing because it was used. The servant asked where the enemy of the protagonist was, while Feng smiled and said that the guy should follow him. It turned out that the guy was being lynched, throwing vegetables at him and insulting him in every possible way. He begged people to stop it all. He confessed that he falsely accused the main character, and that he was the only one to blame for all the troubles. Turns out it was the same hole that the servant dug, and this enemy trying to escape got stuck in it. The protagonist said he couldn't kill this guy because his sister had some influence. The protagonist said it was easy for him to clear his name and kill the city lord, but things are more complicated with this asshole. The servant complained that they couldn't kill the bastard, and then he came up with an ingenious plan because they could do anything they wanted to this man. The main thing was to keep him alive. The protagonist was surprised, because it began to seem to him that his subordinates sometimes surpass him in cruelty. The servants were preparing to teach the boy a lesson that he would not forget for the rest of his life. He, on the other hand, was incredibly frightened, and was afraid to say a word. A moment later, a very loud cry of the boy was heard all around, begging not to be touched. The protagonist and his servants decided to leave the guy behind, as the protagonist had the next plan that he intended to execute. While the guy was incredibly beaten up and talking about how evil people are, sometime late at night he felt just awful. Suddenly the guy saw the main Qin security team, and thought that they had arrived to finally free him, but in fact a formidable man grabbed an axe, then swung it with all his might, then pointed it at the guy who begged for his life, promising that he would do whatever they asked him to do. As it turned out that the man had used the axe to free him, a young man's voice was heard telling Lin not to worry, for they were his own. He said that he was a relative of the prince, and since the guy's sister was engaged to the prince, he was ordered to take the guy to the capital. The guy started laughing and was very happy, because he really started to believe that he would die in this place because of the main character. The guy with a crazy look began to rub this man that he wants revenge on the protagonist, and that otherwise he will not go anywhere. The young man explained that he was ordered to get the guy to the capital, and asked him not to complicate the process. The boy began to say that if the man could help him, he would ask his sister to tell the prince about his merits, and promised to give half of the proceeds of the mine to this man. After these words, the man confessed that such a request would be very hard to refuse. He ordered the two masters who were at the third level of the quenching stage to move out. At that time, the guy was incredibly happy, because he was sure that the protagonist would not be able to deal with such masters in any way. At that time of night in the Qin family's medical garden, the protagonist was lying tied up, and next to him slept a girl who was pushing him very hard. The protagonist did not understand how this could happen, and then he became confused and remembered that it happened a few hours ago. He told the servants that he was going to go to the misty forest. They thought that the protagonist was going to die. The protagonist made a puppet that watered the plants while the servant appeared out of nowhere and began to tell them that the misty forest held great terrors. He said that in addition to the poisonous fog there are many strong monsters, and in order to take even a small part of the forest Qin family had to sacrifice hundreds of warriors. The servants said that they would not let the protagonist go anywhere, then grabbed the rope. In the present, the protagonist was happy about the environment he was in. He had forgotten that in this era, people were afraid of the misty forest. Suddenly, the protagonist heard a noise outside, and then he instantly activated his divine sense. It turned out to be the same masters who came to kill the protagonist. They knocked out the guards and said that they need to kill only the protagonist, that God forbid the investigation did not start. The protagonist began to get rid of the rope, thinking that one master of the level of these guys can easily kill 10 masters of Qi and blood. The protagonist began to walk out pretending not to notice anything, thinking that there was no way he could fight in this place. People looked towards the protagonist, assuming that this was their target. Then the huge man decided to start, and was instantly behind the protagonist's back, ready to finish the battle in an instant. A moment later, the axe went through the neck of the protagonist, and his head flew off to the side. The guy was surprised that this order was so easy. He reached out to pick up the protagonist's head as proof, but suddenly his face twisted as it turned out to be a dummy. They realized that the protagonist had managed to escape as quickly as possible. The protagonist took out the Tianluo fruit, then sat on his horse and started talking about how he didn't plan to die that night. The guys couldn't believe that the guy deceived them so easily, while the hero started to move at a great speed with the help of the horse. Thinking about the safety of his people, he planned to take the enemies as far away as possible. At that time, the enemies thought that the hero was a brainless fool, for instead of calling the guards he started to run away alone. A moment later, the masters at great speed began to catch up with the protagonist, who was ready for such an outcome and sprayed some liquid in the air, after which it hit the faces of two enemies who were chasing him. The opponents could not navigate properly. Even opening their eyes caused difficulty. The protagonist was very glad that his opponents were so stupid, because he could not believe that they would fall for his tricks, and then the hero used a divine sense, thanks to which he could see at night as if it were daytime and easily move on horseback. One of the enemies was right in front of the protagonist, after which the guys instantly attacked the guy from above. A few moments later there was a huge explosion from those blows. The protagonist was able to bounce at the last moment, while not understanding how such a thing was possible. He didn't understand how enemies without sight could catch up to him and attack him effectively. The enemy pointed to a horse and said it was a guy, while another man said it was a horse. Suddenly, the protagonist realized that now his enemies are hunters, who are hunting him by scent. One of the enemies pointed in the direction of the hero and said that he was definitely there, after which the enemies instantly began to run after the protagonist, who began to tear his clothes in hopes of spreading his scent around, thus winning the opportunity to escape from these enemies. The enemy was not surprised by the protagonist's attempts to spread his scent to confuse the guys. Suddenly they found themselves on a cliff, and in front of them there was only a misty forest, in which it is definitely not possible to survive. The protagonist was surprised that he turned on the road that led him to the misty forest. Enemies started to say that the guy would definitely not have the courage to jump into this forest. The enemy began to say that if the hero stayed he would at least die without suffering, while the guy crushed one of the fruits, and with a mad expression on his face said that he had huge balls. With these words he began to fall at a great speed straight into the misty forest. He gave his enemies the middle finger saying that he would never give up so easily. The enemies were amazed that the guy actually dared to jump down while the protagonist was flying straight into the misty forest at a great speed. The enemies were saying that the guy would definitely die instantly in that place. They were going to wait for the fog to clear up a bit and take the hero's head as proof of his death. The enemies were laughing at the top of their voices because of the fact that this guy would die so easily because of the fog. While the protagonist was glowing with happiness, he was glad to be in this place. In this place, he saw a huge amount of medicinal plants that were very old. The protagonist drank an antidote beforehand, for he knew very well that this place had a deadly fog. The protagonist looked at his hand and realized that he didn't have much time. He was going to prepare some remedy from the local herbs. He was glowing with happiness because now he would be working with high-quality herbs. 2 hours later, the protagonist was working with the herbs and heard a strange noise nearby. The protagonist was amazed that it was a raccoon dog, which is incredibly hard to catch. He assumed it was the effect of his anti-animal pill. Suddenly the hero's attention was attracted by something strange. He began to laugh, because in his head came an ingenious plan to deal with his enemies. Early in the morning, when the fog cleared, the enemies arrived in the forest to find the corpse of the protagonist. They searched for the body of the guy, as they thought that he died instantly. A moment later they found the corpse of the hero, and believed that he was suffering before death from poison. The man prepared to chop off the protagonist's head, but suddenly the guy jumped up and launched some darts towards the enemies. They were able to instantly react and dodge, while marveling that the protagonist managed to survive in this place. The enemies thought that it was a very stupid move on the part of the guy, while the hero with a confident expression said that he would really have a hard time injuring enemies of this level, and then asked what would happen if the blood of a raccoon dog collided with a miasma tree in the sunlight. The enemies, with full confidence that their situation was not the same, said that even masters like them would die from 10 breaths. But such an animal was incredibly hard to find. At that time the protagonist started counting down from 10. Suddenly the enemies noticed the fog and didn't realize what was happening. They looked in the direction where the needles hit, then instantly realized that right now they are breathing a poisonous fog that can kill them. The protagonist confessed that he had accidentally found the animal, and instantly realized how it could be put to good use. That was the reason why he risked pretending to be dead, and so that the enemies could not even think of such a thing, he attacked them with darts. The opponents were out of their minds with anger. They were going to take the protagonist with them to the other world. The protagonist was completely confident, and was amazed that they reacted so late. He looked with his piercing gaze and said that it was too late, and a moment later the enemies started coughing up their own blood, after which they lost consciousness and fell to the ground, while the protagonist continued to stand with his head proudly raised. The protagonist's enemies were lying on the ground. They were defeated not by brute force but by the protagonist's mind. Suddenly behind the back of the guy appeared the eyes of monsters. They were dogs, in which the hero apologized for borrowing a few drops of blood of their kin, then provided the corpses of enemies to eat these animals, thinking that he not only dealt with the enemies, but also got a huge amount of useful plants. While in the main character's house, the servants could not believe that their lord had been killed. They thought it was complete nonsense. While a man threw the protagonist's item and said that it could serve as proof of his death. It turned out to be the bloody saddle of the protagonist's horse. The enemies said that the young man had been injured, after which he had dared to enter the misty forest, where he had definitely died. The boys could not believe what they heard, for the hero really wanted to go to the misty forest. At that time, the enemy was incredibly happy, saying that the fool dared to venture alone into this hellish place. He said that because of the hero's death, the iron mine should return to its original owner, and the medical garden as well. He ordered the royal guard to chase away the servants of the protagonist. The soldiers pointed their weapons at the poor people, to the bastard's words that he now owns all of the protagonist's property. Suddenly, Feng's voice was heard behind the backs of the enemies, who was surprised that the guy dared to flatter him. The protagonist was surprised that the enemy dared to ask for help from the royal guards, then called him a slippery son of a bitch. The girl instantly hugged the protagonist, because she was very happy to see him, and he confessed that he decided to take a night walk in the misty forest. At that time, the enemy with shaking hands could not believe that the protagonist had survived after being in the misty forest. The protagonist said that he just decided to take a walk. Why would he die? A man stepped in and said that he was in this place to discuss the rights to the iron mine. The servant at the time realized that this eunuch is now a representative of the royal family, and the protagonist cannot oppose him. At that time, the protagonist said he didn't give a shit who this man represented. The protagonist was outraged, saying that he had been spoiled by the insistence to kill, and it didn't matter what family the man was from. He dared to kill him anyway. The protagonist recalled that a few days ago, the city lord who had decided to join this guy was hanged, and then the protagonist confessed that he had ordered the order to completely destroy the lord's mansion, and that it was his will. The protagonist said that suddenly and in the forest they tried to kill him, but he used the order again and the masters instantly killed the offenders. The protagonist warned that if the enemy dared to offend him, he would use the order again, and then the guards would chop him to pieces, and then asked what the man wanted to discuss. The enemy was shocked that the assassins he had sent were killed. He was shocked that the hero had orders. The man was shaking with fear. He fully realized how scary the thing in the hands of the protagonist was, after which they instantly began to say that they had just come to visit the protagonist. After which they all bowed to the protagonist together and wished him success and prosperity. The protagonist said he wouldn't see the guests off because he was a mess, and they apologized for the intrusion and wanted to leave. A moment later they started running away at great speed in fear of the protagonist. The servant was amazed that the protagonist had several orders, and the hero confessed that it was just a shell casing from a used order, which made the servant praise the protagonist's masterful bluff. The girl asked where the protagonist actually went because she was so worried. He said that he had already told her that he was really in the misty forest where he had managed to get a lot of useful herbs. The servant began to ask the protagonist not to lie, because the misty forest is not a place from which you can so easily return, and he asked where the harvest, about which Feng said. The protagonist confessed that he had gathered so many medicinal herbs that he had to supply the horse with them, and then pointed behind his back, where the horse was struggling to pull the incredibly heavy load. Inside were incredibly valuable and very rare herbs. While the servants couldn't believe what they were seeing, the protagonist yawned indifferently, asking the servants to help unload the harvest. The servant realized that the protagonist's methods were unattainable, and assumed he could never understand them. A few days later, the guy was taken to his sister's wedding. He surrounded himself with guards, and complained inside the wagon that he had made a huge number of attempts to end the protagonist, and now he wanted to do absolutely nothing. While the protagonist was deep in thought about the royal family stationing troops in his city, he assumed they were beginning to fear him. The protagonist turned to a servant and said that starting today, the wages of all the guards would be doubled. The servant was amazed at this generosity and didn't understand what the protagonist was planning to do. While the protagonist with a crazy look said that the servant to form a squad, because they will go to the misty forest to clean up. The servant was astonished at such a statement. He didn't understand how he could go to such a dangerous place. While Feng told the servant not to worry and just form a squad. The protagonist thought that this way he would be able to form a huge military force, because soon everyone will start to explore places like the misty forest. The next day, the guards gathered, who could not believe in the statement of the protagonist. He said that this is not a joke. He also added that not everyone will pass the selection, but he will get triple pay. The soldiers rejoiced and could not wait for the moment when the hero told them who would train them. At that time, Feng pointed to himself and said that he would be the person who would prepare the soldiers for transportation. After such a statement, the soldiers were speechless, and then immediately began to leave the gathering place with the thoughts that it was early morning and their master as always joking. The servant began to ponder that the main character's foundation was the weakest of them all. How could he teach someone martial arts? The protagonist decided to ignore it all and decided to go shopping with the servant because he needs weapons for his future squad. The servant was shocked that the protagonist was only lucky to get out of the misty forest alive, and he already considers himself a genius. At that time, in one of the restaurants, a man told that the hero had only one order, and that he had deceived them. The man instantly became furious at such news, whereupon the mug instantly shattered on the floor. The herbalist was very angry because the man had dared to spill tea on his foot, and he asked the herbalist what he could do about it. The man was incredibly angry. In fact, he was angry because of the protagonist, because he was the reason for what he decided to authorize. Gorilla with great speed began to approach the man, with the intention of hitting him. The man easily stopped the blow of this gorilla with one of his hands, and then asked how the protagonist messed up the man. The gatherer told him that Feng was a lowlife who had gotten him into trouble. The man told the assembler that they were brothers in misfortune, as he also hated Feng. The man learned about the mysterious alchemy teacher, and decided that the situation was now clearer. The gatherer started talking about how the most important thing for an alchemist is herbs, and they need to destroy the main character's garden first. The man said that there was no way he could do something like that because it would start a war between the royal family and the Qin family. The gatherer told of a pill that attracts animals, which could be used to raise the protagonist's garden to the ground. The gatherer confessed that in order to realize this plan, he just needed money. The man was incredibly happy about this opportunity. He confessed that he was ready to spend any amount of money to solve this issue, while the protagonist was busy making pills for the body. Usually, alchemists have a hard time with this process because it is very difficult to create these pills. But the protagonist closed his eyes and then put his hand on the cauldron. He is the god of pills. It is quite easy for him. The quality of the pills was from 1 to 10, and the ones he just made were at 9. The guy threw one of the pills into his mouth. He thought about the fact that it had been a long time since he had made such cheap pills. He also thought that if he wanted to sell the pills, he should lower their quality. Unexpectedly, the protagonist was able to break through to the 6th level of the Qi and blood stage. The effect of the pill was amazing. The protagonist took out the next pill, which should have a positive effect on his body, because growing too fast was dangerous. The guy with a smile on his face grabbed this pill with his teeth. The protagonist was determined to become the best. He thought about being the first to start the battle for the misty forest. At that time, the girl was watching the protagonist's room and wondering if he was able to overcome the foundation of his cultivation. The girl thought about how it was very hard for the protagonist after his injury, and decided that he had decided to try hard to become stronger. The girl firmly decided that she would also do her best, and right now she was going to not let anyone interfere with the main character. At that time, the smell of some pill began to spread to the forest, suddenly announced an alarm, because fierce beasts were approaching them. The girl could not believe that fierce beasts appeared at such an inopportune moment, for the protagonist still had not completed the breakthrough. Suddenly, the spear of one of the soldiers broke against the tough skin of the beast. Although the soldiers were able to surround the animal, they could not break through its tough armor, while the beast easily attacked them and threw them high into the air. Suddenly, An arrow began to fly towards the monster at a great speed. People were shocked that it was able to affect this animal. It turned out that it was a girl who used her bow to attack the enemy. The guards began to cheer and praise the girl, as suddenly they were attacked again by the monster, which made the soldiers run away, because they only made these beasts angry. While the enemies rejoiced that they had successfully succeeded in their plan, because such a beast, even a master of the final stage, is not easy to cope with. They were very much waiting for the moment when the protagonist would know despair and finally perish. While the monster was moving towards the little girl at a great speed, she prepared to shoot from her bow with great determination in her eyes. The arrow bounced off the body of this strong monster. While the soldiers were shouting that there was no way the girl could stop this beast, it was getting closer and closer to her. She grabbed her sword, then confessed that she had to help the protagonist. She could not let this beast pass through her. Swinging her sword, she thought that even if she died in this fight, she would not retreat. Suddenly, the sword instantly broke into small pieces from the animal's solid body, and the girl's body began to be covered with countless wounds. It seemed that she could not resist this animal at all, while the enemies were incredibly happy that the animal would destroy the protagonist very soon. The monster was a few centimeters away from ending the poor girl's life, as suddenly she opened her eyes and saw the main character's chest. All the guards were shocked by what they saw. The protagonist, flying to the ground, said that anyone who infringed on the lives of his people deserved to die. The guy landed on the roof after he found out that the girl was okay. He asked her to leave the battlefield and leave everything to him. The girl began to say that the protagonist could not defeat such a monster, because it was on a completely different level. While Feng was completely confident, and began to say that he would not allow any animal to do whatever he wanted. While the enemies mocked the protagonist, because in their opinion he didn't even stand a chance against this animal. The monster pointed its horns in the direction of the protagonist. While the soldiers were worried about their master, the enemies couldn't wait for the denouement of it all. While the protagonist didn't understand why people were panicking so much, he grabbed his dagger and said with a brutal look that he would just blow up the monster. After that, the hero instantly used the moonlight technique, thus attacking the enemy. The dagger pierced through the thick skin of the beast, which stunned the opponents, and the allies were shocked by the demonstrated strength, while the girl was delighted by the protagonist. The protagonist thought that normally only masters of the tempering stage could infuse qi into weapons, but since he had studied a strong martial art and had advanced to the 7th stage, it was also possible for him to do so. In his previous life, the protagonist was familiar with countless martial techniques even though he couldn't use them, but things were completely different in this life. The protagonist directed another attack towards his opponent, which instantly reached its target and was able to pierce through the beast's skin, thus damaging it. The protagonist began to move at a great speed, thinking that moonlight is an amazing martial art. Then the protagonist was right in front of his opponent, which made the soldiers worried because fighting with this monster in close proximity is the same as going to certain death. As the monster prepared to finish off the protagonist, the girl started screaming, worried about her master. The monster launched its attack, and the ground around it began to crumble from its power. The enemies cheered, the girl began to cry, while the soldiers were anxious. And the protagonist himself heard the words of the enemies and asked who it was that died. The protagonist hovered above his enemy. Thanks to the moonlight technique, he could easily dodge such attacks. The protagonist prepared to deliver a decisive blow, and then he landed with all his might, destroying everything in his path and sealing the beast directly into the ground. None of the people watching could believe this was actually happening. While the monster was literally destroyed in an instant, which amazed the soldiers who immediately began to run to the protagonist. The girl also admired the protagonist, who looked very cool standing on the corpse of this animal. The protagonist, with pride in his voice, asked his soldiers whether they still consider him a man who is not able to teach them something. Without waiting for an answer, the protagonist said that now the soldiers have one last chance to enroll in his team. After that, all the soldiers raised their hands. They were incredibly happy about this opportunity, because they were sure that with the instruction of the protagonist they will instantly become stronger. The protagonist was pleased with this attention and asked the guys to calm down because they need to take the body of the monster to the warehouse because he had some plans for it. The guys started dragging the huge corpse of the animal towards the warehouse, While the protagonist realized that behind all this is a pill, the smell of which he could smell, he was sure that someone was involved in all this. Then the hero instantly used the divine feeling, and just as quickly found the enemies who began to argue among themselves. They were blaming each other for the defeat, and were ready to tear each other apart. The enemies continued to argue fiercely, after which the rock under their feet began to crack, and they at a great speed flew down, thereby printing in the ground. While the protagonist thanked the fools, for they had given him a fine bull carcass. A few days later, all the guards joined the protagonist and waited for the speech. The protagonist, with confidence in his eyes, said that he would share the cure from his alchemist teacher and help the soldiers become much stronger. The protagonist began to tell that the girl showed herself with a very good side, and he decided to reward her with bull armor. He also added that if the squad will appear in the same brave people, he will reward them with different awards. The guy began to hand the armor to the girl, under the enthusiastic emotions of the soldiers. The protagonist also announced that every guard who was present that night would receive a body-hardening pill, and everyone thanked the protagonist for his kindness. Feng announced that within a month he would choose the best guys and they would become members of the squad that would go to clean up the misty forest. The protagonist, with a proud look, said that he is worthy to encourage his people, for which the guards thanked the guy. Meanwhile, in a tavern in Yuning City, people were talking about the news, namely that the protagonist was gathering a team to go to the misty forest, and a man thought that the guy would ruin everyone. After that, people even started betting on how many people would come back alive after the trip, and almost everyone thought that all the soldiers would die, or at most 2 or 3 would be able to escape. Suddenly a man started yelling that only his family was betting that no one would survive. He began to say that everyone else should bet that all members of the expedition would return alive, and asked who would dare to go against the royal family. The man started shouting and said that anyone who didn't bet would lose their head. People were crying, and thought that their money had been taken away from them, because not a single troop that had been in the misty forest had not returned without losses. It turned out that the pill was very expensive, and the man decided to resort to such methods because the money is running out. The man was going to secretly attack the protagonist right in the forest. He thought that this way the bet will definitely play. Half a month later, the guy reported that he had gathered a group of hunters who had been selected. They lined up in front of the protagonist. They were perfectly equipped, they had a full set of weapons and armor. The protagonist began to say that this was their first expedition, and it would not be easy, but he believed in every soldier who had been trained by him. The protagonist and his squad began their journey. At the end, the protagonist said that he believed in his guys, and asked them not to let him down. The protagonist led the expedition, and warned that the first danger was poison, after which the squad drank the medicine and the protagonist noted that now this aspect is not a danger to them. The second danger was poisonous insects and beasts, that's why they moved in formation, and if there is no panic, no one will get hurt. The protagonist asked his team members to follow him and keep up. The protagonist used technology to sense danger before anyone else. He believed that at this rate they would not lose a single person. The soldiers said that the protagonist explained everything so clearly that it seemed as if he had not accidentally gotten out of this place in the past, but knew something. The soldiers decided to be a little arbitrary, and move forward a little to show the protagonist that they are not weak. The guys started moving and looking for prey. They seemed to feel as confident as possible, while above them appeared a dangerous insect. One of the squad members looked in that direction, and a moment later this terrible creature began to fly directly to his face. The protagonist instantly reacted without realizing what was happening, while the soldiers started to run, at the sight of the steel centipede. Suddenly an arrow slammed into the body of the insect, which sealed it to a tree, scaring one of the guards. It turned out that it was another member of the squad, who was surprised that the guy had shit his pants at the sight of some insect. The young boy began to admire the man, who began to brag that this was not his first time in the misty forest, and that he had more experience. While the insects were very close to these guys, the protagonist instantly shouted for them to look around. Feng explained that centipede corpses make sounds that attract other centipedes, which is why now a huge number of these monsters have arrived. Feng shouted for the people to start holding formation. The people couldn't gather properly. They felt confused. One of the people couldn't even load an arrow into the crossbow properly because of the panic. The young guy asked why the man froze. After all, he was already in this place and shouldn't panic. The man fell to his knees because he thought that his life would be cut short at this moment in time, because he could kill one, at most 2 centipedes, but he would not be able to cope with so many. The centipedes rushed towards the man who was shouting that they would all definitely die in this place. The other centipedes also attacked the other members of the squad, who were also frightened, although they tried to fight back. The protagonist called everyone idiots and ordered everyone to hide behind him, then started flying towards the guys at a great speed. Feng used the moonlight martial art, after which a huge amount of energy flew towards the enemies. One of the soldiers cried as he watched the huge horde of insects getting closer and closer. While the protagonist was saving the members of his squad, which caused him to be injured by the insects, the man couldn't believe what had just happened, because their master had just covered the ordinary soldiers with his body. The man started crying, while the girl and her servant went to the hero to help him. Feng ordered the guys not to move because they would not be able to cope with so many enemies. The protagonist took out his dagger, and then began to kill a huge number of these enemies. However, the enemies also did not stand still and effectively attacked the protagonist, who despite the wounds continued the battle, killing more and more monsters. Suddenly, one of the monsters crept up to the protagonist from behind. The guys began to scream, because they were very worried about the hero, while Feng deftly killed the creature, which was behind his back, and then continued to madly destroy a huge number of enemies, under the tears of his wards. They could not believe what they saw, because the protagonist had just single-handedly killed all the enemies they feared so much. The soldiers were very happy that they were alive, while the man began to cry with all his might and was also happy to be alive. Feng grabbed the man and started yelling at him as Feng explained the rules that the man didn't follow. The protagonist with a crazy look began to shout that because of the man's ill-considered actions the whole team could have died. And if the protagonist had not been able to interrupt everyone, they would have continued to shake with fear and do nothing. The man was crying. He didn't know what to say to such a thing. While the protagonist retreated and started coughing heavily, his whole body was covered with wounds. The guys instantly ran towards the protagonist, as they lived for him. While the soldiers realized that they had failed their young master, because of which they almost died. The protagonist said that he was fine. It was just that one of the centipedes managed to poison him. The protagonist was thinking that he could really die now, and this was their first mission. He was going to go home because at this rate they were all going to die. As the soldiers fell to their knees and started talking about how the hero shouldn't punish them. One of the soldiers explained that they had endangered all the members of the expedition, and were obliged to leave the team voluntarily. After these words, they began to leave with the words that they have no right to stay in this place. At that time, the hero threw a bag, then asked where they were going. The protagonist realized that the soldier joined the team to earn money to treat his parents. He said that he would not let him go so easily. It turned out that the bag was filled with recovery pills and the soldiers couldn't understand what was going on. The protagonist with an unbelievable look began to say that even strong heroes make mistakes, but in such situations the most important thing is to draw conclusions. He said that they need to rest a little and continue their journey, and they can talk about punishment later. The soldiers could not believe what they heard, because it was because of them that the main character almost died. Feng said that the soldiers had better do some useful work and find a safe place to camp. He promised that he would bring everyone out alive if they obeyed. From that moment, 3 days passed and they settled in one place. The protagonist thought that the elixir in his body was too weak to deal with the poison. He decided to use the technique to detoxify, but the problem was that in such a state he would not be able to fight. Suddenly a soldier's voice was heard, shouting that they were approaching poisonous insects. The protagonist immediately went out to find out what was going on. It turned out in front of them was just a huge number of poisonous spiders. They were bloody spiders, and there were so many of them that the protagonist realized that they could not cope. The protagonist started screaming for people to run. He was going to fight alone. He was going to fight with all his might to protect his men who were not yet ready for this battle. While the man shouted for all the soldiers to take up defensive positions, he said that the soldiers would protect the cave even at the cost of their lives, for the hero had not yet completed his detoxification. The soldiers instantly stood in front of the protagonist, ready to defend him at the cost of their lives. The servant used some kind of remedy, after which the protagonist was very surprised, because the soldiers reacted incredibly fast, and also used a pill to scare away the beasts. The soldiers began to move as cohesively as possible, after which they were able to trap a large number of spiders. The protagonist stopped the man because although the spiders couldn't jump, they were making webs at an incredible level while the spiders started to climb upwards, while the man realized that this was what they needed and took out a torch, then threw the torch directly into the pit with the spiders. A moment later, a very strong flame rose up. It turned out that the protagonist himself had taught the soldiers such trickery. The protagonist couldn't believe what he saw, while a huge spider paw appeared from the fire, and a moment later a spider queen appeared in front of them, which even a master of the tempering stage would be incredibly hard to deal with. At that time, the soldiers did not hesitate to rush into battle, believing that if they could defeat the small ones, they would be able to kill the big one. The soldiers remembered the hero's words that if the enemy is much stronger, the stupidest thing to do is to run away from the battlefield. The soldiers started to approach the huge spider, then all prepared to attack, and they simultaneously started their attack. Suddenly it was effective and the spider's blood started to come out. The man confessed that while the hero was sitting in the camp, they analyzed all of Feng's lessons, then said that they were willing to give their lives for the protagonist. At this moment they looked just perfect. While Feng was amazed at how they had changed in just a few days, they were even able to destroy the queen. The protagonist confessed to underestimating the guys, and said that they could then begin the main purpose of their mission. The servant assumed it was to send them home. The protagonist said that the soldiers had progressed tremendously, and now they would definitely go on to find as many spiritual herbs as possible, and take them all home. The next day, a huge number of people gathered in the safe zone near the entrance of the misty forest, praying for someone to survive, as they were forced to make an insane bet. While the man himself was sure that no one could survive, he didn't believe that such a young guy could come back with the whole team. The man hoped that the main character had died in the forest as well as his team. Suddenly one of the people started shouting that he was seeing something and the man was surprised. At that time a man from the crowd started yelling that no one had come out yet, but hope always dies last. While a member of the royal family was amazed, because the sounds were from a crow that was flying nearby. All the people lost all hope that they could see their money, while the enemy was incredibly happy, because he was the only one who bet that the main character will not be able to return and will lose the whole team. The man started demanding money from the poor people, who tried to explain that it was the last thing they had. The man with a crazy look started shouting that he is a representative of royalty and the man should pay the money right now. Suddenly, the voice of the protagonist was heard, surprised at the number of people and the fact that the man would not calm down. Feng assumed that the whole city wanted to keep them out, but in fact it was much simpler than he thought. The protagonist began to mock the enemy who believed he was going to die, and moreover, a full squad began to emerge from the forest with a huge amount of loot. This shocked the enemy, who a moment ago was confident in his victory, while people were rejoicing, because they had just won and won money. The man began to walk away, while saying that the protagonist was just lucky. Feng instantly stopped the enemy. He reminded this madman that he lost money to all the inhabitants of this city, and is trying to escape without paying. The man started yelling again that he was a royalty and he wasn't going to give anything back, assuming that the protagonist couldn't do anything. Feng said that he really couldn't do anything. He was going to put up posters everywhere saying that the man owed money to everyone in the city, and he was sure that the royal family wouldn't be happy about that. The man was incredibly frightened because if the hero really did that, he would be finished. A quarter of an hour later, there was a huge amount of equipment and clothes on the ground. The man was screaming that he had to give up everything he had, to pawn literally everything, even the clothes of his guards, to pay off the debt. The protagonist began to count whether it is enough to pay off the debt, and said that if the man still give up his underwear, then it may be enough. At the end of this event, the enemies of the protagonist ran away in tears. They had nothing on, not even underwear, which made the villagers laugh with these people. The people thanked the protagonist for standing up for them, but he said that no thanks were needed, because he had done so in his own interest. The protagonist said that he would often go into the forest with his team, and asked for people's support in the future. The people agreed and promised to help the protagonist. Since then, 3 days have passed. The enemies gathered around the fire, as they had absolutely nothing left. Suddenly heard a male voice behind the back of the guys, which suggested that the hero relies on the power of the mysterious alchemist. It turned out that it was a first-class alchemist, who was sent by that bastard from the capital to help the guys kill the protagonist. A huge hammer landed on the ground. It turned out that the protagonist had ordered it from the people of this city. Feng was incredibly happy that his order was fulfilled so quickly. Then he grabbed the hammer and decided to try it out. The hammer slowly began to rise above the ground, and then the back of the protagonist began to ache incredibly badly. It seemed to be beyond his capabilities. Feng was shaking from the pain in his back. At that time, the servant asked if he needed to be remodeled. The protagonist surprised his men by saying that this was the kind of hammer he needed. In fact, he had mastered the new skill, but not to the fullest extent. It was for this reason that the protagonist decided to take the hammer as a weapon. The next day, the guys went to the foggy forest to the swamp, where the hero reported that they found another suitable place. It turned out that in this swamp there were huge mud crabs, which could be caught and sold for a lot of money. Suddenly the protagonist felt that someone was approaching them, after which he instantly began to move in the direction of the movement, and ordered the servants to go to a safe place until he walks a little. After a moment, the protagonist arrived at the place where he felt the movement. It turned out that it was the same alchemist and a man from the royal family. The alchemist was saying that today they will turn this forest into a grave for the protagonist. The protagonist listened attentively and watched the enemies. The protagonist understood that they could not cope with such opponents, and it would be difficult to escape because they were moving on their route. One of the soldiers reported to the eunuch that the tracks had become much fresher, and he was sure that they would soon find the team, while the enemy began to move faster in a hurry to kill the protagonist as soon as possible. They all started running at a great speed, and a moment later the enemy had a look of horror on his face as they started to fall right into the swamp. They were all in the swamp and began to move frantically. The enemy could not believe that they fell into the swamp, where the crabs lived, and a moment later in their direction began to fly hammer at great speed, which instantly knocked out one of the enemies. It turned out that it was the protagonist, who prepared a great trap for his enemies. The protagonist confessed that he knew that the enemy would want revenge, and he ordered his men to make fake tracks to lure them into the swamp. The protagonist began to deliver a series of blows to the enemy cavalry with his new weapon. When it was the eunuch's turn, he became very frightened and tried to run away. But suddenly the alchemist entered the battle and with a kick of his foot was able to repel the hammer flying at the man. The alchemist said that the man is a representative of the royal family, and the hero has no right to even lay a finger on him. The protagonist wondered why the alchemist was getting involved in the battle instead of just practicing alchemy. The alchemist seemed angry at such words, and a moment later he disappeared from sight, and a moment later he appeared in front of the hero and gave a very strong blow with his knee, saying that he was not an ordinary alchemist. Feng couldn't understand how the enemy was able to approach him so quickly. He didn't understand how this alchemist had such strength, while the enemy started laughing, then took off his outer clothes and called the alchemy master of the royal family, who was also a martial arts master of the tempering stage. The protagonist was shocked that his enemy turned out to be a master of the second stage. The enemy confessed that because of the protagonist's actions, the royal family had personally asked him to deal with the protagonist. Feng was shocked that the enemy had very cleverly concealed his strength, while the enemy was instantly in front of the protagonist, assuming that Feng was a warrior who relied on strength. The enemy appeared behind the protagonist's back and confessed to relying on speed. The enemy moved at an incredible speed, paralleling Feng's inability to even touch him due to the difference in speed. At one point, the enemy was able to knock the protagonist's weapon from his hands, and wondered how the hero would fight him. The enemy suggested that without the hammer, the protagonist was incapable of doing anything, but Feng asked how the speedy type was able to wrestle his hammer away with such ease, and the enemy confessed that his technique was based on leg strength. The enemy was ready to strike with his foot, saying that although he was inferior in strength, his legs were much stronger than the protagonist. Feng tried to block this strong attack, after which he was thrown a decent distance away. The enemy praised the protagonist for having such strength only at the chi and blood stage, while the protagonist confessed that he had underestimated the enemy. At that time, the enemy took some pill and then began to move at a great speed directly to the protagonist. The enemy was confident in his speed, and before the protagonist could not keep up with him, but now his speed has become twice as fast. The enemy was cheering, saying that Feng could not do anything against such an opponent. While the enemy was preparing to end the battle with an incredibly strong blow, the protagonist stood and did not react to the enemy's movement, and a moment later, A knee appeared right in front of the enemy. It was an incredibly strong and fast punch from the protagonist that sent the alchemist flying. The enemy lost some of his teeth and couldn't believe that this was actually happening. As the man's enthusiasm faded, he didn't realize what had just happened. While the enemy asked how this could happen, because the difference in their speed was obvious. The protagonist confessed that he had never actually said that he was emphasizing strength. In fact, he had recently learned a speed technique called ghost dance. It's a great technique, and the person who learned it becomes incredibly fast, which is why the protagonist took a heavy hammer to limit his speed, because he's not quite used to it. During the battle with the alchemist, the protagonist also realized the flaws in his martial arts and became stronger. The protagonist began to approach the enemy at a great speed, now realizing how to use his new power in battle. Feng, with joy on his face, said that he missed a lot of blows from the enemy, and now he intends to return all the blows to him. The protagonist began to take the medicine, after which 3 residual images of the protagonist appeared in front of the enemy and began to approach him at a great speed. The enemies were shocked that the hero managed to leave 3 residual images. While the protagonist was already right in front of his opponent, ready to deliver a decisive blow, the enemy was instantly pierced from all sides, after which he instantly fell to the ground under the man's screams. Feng was about to finish off his longtime enemy who was begging for his life. He fell to his knees and started begging for forgiveness, blaming the third prince for all his troubles. The protagonist said that he had already realized that the man was innocent of anything, then instantly struck a blow from which the neck of the enemy broke, and he fell to the ground under the words of the hero that the enemy is better to say these words in the other world. Right now Feng was going to drown the bodies of his enemies in the swamp, and was glad that now no one will not interfere with his trips to the forest. A few days later the royal family got word that their people were missing and they sent men to investigate. They were going to execute the entire family of the man who killed their family members. The man banged a wooden bar on the table, then said that the main character's team was in the forest at that moment and asked if they had killed the people. The protagonist said with a smile on his face that he didn't know what the man was talking about, and then he started to play the fool and cry, saying that every trip into the woods made him afraid, and the team as well. Under the influence of such fear he wouldn't dare to touch someone from the royal family. The servant also cried and told that in the forest they were waiting for a huge number of failures. Even then they were attacked by a huge number of insects. All the soldiers also began to cry and tell how terrible it was to survive in that forest. The girl also told about the bloody spiders and how they miraculously managed to get out of that place alive. The main character decided to show the insect bites on his ass, because they still hadn't healed, and the judge ordered the guy to stop now. The judge was incredibly angry listening to these stories. He just couldn't believe that a group of these losers could kill the elite of the Yi family. The protagonist sat on the throne and was happy that he got away with it. He also said that the soldiers made him very happy, and he said that he would help those who reached level 9 Qi and blood to advance to the tempering stage. All the guys were incredibly excited about this opportunity, as the hero also promised 20 gold to those guys who would successfully make the breakthrough. The protagonist realized that although the pill was expensive and rare, but for his subordinates, he was not sorry to splurge. At night in the garden, the protagonist was going to make a very complicated pill. If he succeeded, his skills would be known to everyone. The protagonist realized that some people should not get information about his skills, so he was going to use the pill for his own purposes. The protagonist put the soul-returning herb in the furnace, then wanted to wake up the soul of the iron bull. The furnace was covered with flames and the lid flew up. The protagonist was overjoyed because the spirit of the iron bull appeared before him, which he wanted to use to prepare the pill. The bull started moving while the hero was talking about the monster's body being under his control. The hero was even surprised that the bull thought the soul could escape. Then the protagonist started to use the soul capture technique and the bull started to return to the furnace. Then the protagonist started to form the pill. The protagonist was overjoyed as the creation of the complex pill was very successful. The protagonist instantly threw the pill into his mouth, and then began to use the power of the pill for his advancement, although it was very effective, but also brought great pain, and distraction during this process is not allowed. The protagonist's clothes began to tear from the blows of his own aura. At his stage it was quite risky to take such a strong pill. As soon as the pill enters the body, the meridians began to get very damaged. The protagonist had 100,000 years of experience with pills and the negative effect was minimal. The protagonist began to lose consciousness from the immense pain his body was experiencing. His house began to glow very brightly from within, after which the protagonist was able to break through to the 8th level of the Qi and blood stage. The protagonist was of course very happy that he was able to break through, but he was also sure that there were still some pill resources left in his body that he hadn't used. The guy instantly began to break through to the next stage, which released a huge amount of energy. The glow was now many times stronger and covered an area much larger. Everything was successful, and now the protagonist had the peak of Qi and blood power, namely level 9. The protagonist felt that he had become much stronger than in his previous life at a similar stage of development. The guy used a small part of his power, and the aura fist began to demolish everything in its path at a tremendous speed. The protagonist was incredibly happy, because now his punching power reached 750 kilograms, and now he was not inferior in strength to the masters of the hardening stage. Suddenly, a girl appeared near the hole in the wall who decided to ask if the hero was finished with the pill. The guy immediately approached her and closed her mouth, saying that no one should know about his success in alchemy, because then they would all just be executed. The girl started talking about how as soon as the clan head found out that the hero had become a rank 3 alchemist, he would definitely take them all to the capital, and she didn't understand why the hero didn't want to do that. The protagonist said that he didn't want to be at the beck and call of the main branches of his clan, and he wouldn't be able to stay together with the girl in the capital. Now she seemed to understand. The girl thought that the protagonist had just confessed his feelings, while in fact the protagonist was going to continue to use the girl and her skills for his own purposes. The protagonist thought that his ex-wife was going to organize a banquet in the capital. He was going to take revenge for all the suffering that the girl had caused him in his past life. A while later, his father said that he had heard rumors that the protagonist had done many important things. His father also asked his son to stay in the city as long as possible. The father also said that even if the royal family became his son's target, he would still stay by his side. The protagonist was shocked that his father cared for him so much, and then he suddenly asked for permission to go to the capital to see his grandmother, who would soon be 90 years old. Feng said that he needed his father's permission to do so, and his father said that if the protagonist went to the capital, he would definitely become a target for the prince, and then he would be in danger. The protagonist said that he is a warrior, and he is not going to hide in terror when he hears the prince's name. Suddenly the protagonist started laughing. Then he started attacking his father with his fist, saying that he is no longer a weakling. The father took his son's attack with his palm, after which he was shocked because his son was completely able to recover his cultivation foundation. The protagonist revealed that he had not only grown in strength, he also revealed that 5 of his men had already managed to break through to the 9th level of the Qi and blood stage. He also revealed that the weakest of his men was at the 5th Qi and blood stage, and added that each of them had experience in battles. His father was shocked because before, the strongest guard was only at level 5, while the hero was happy about the work he had done. His father assumed that the protagonist had given away all the fruits to exchange them for self-improvement pills, but the hero calmed his father down and then told him to look at their fields. He showed the fields that were filled to the top with valuable plants, and also said that he had long ago issued a norm of herbs to the clan, and even if he sells the excess will be able to earn at least 100,000 gold. Father was shocked that after the tribute, the protagonist was able to increase the amount of fruit several times. The father tried to check if he was awake and if this was really happening, while the protagonist was proud of himself and the work he had done. The father grabbed his son's shoulder and said that he wouldn't mind if the protagonist wanted to go to the capital. The father asked his son to always stay cool, because if there was a chance to avoid conflict, it was better to do so, and the father also promised to always help the protagonist. At that time, Feng bowed to his father and promised to follow his advice. The main character gathered soldiers before the engagement is still a month, and he was going to be engaged in their training. The girl the guy taught to prepare pills that she would provide the hunters with pills after his departure. Half a month later the main character and his servant went to the capital, officially to his grandmother, but actually to take revenge on his ex-wife. Since that moment 6 days had passed and they were outside the capital, the protagonist was very tired and he was glad that after such a long journey they had time to rest. The servant was also glad to have a chance to rest, because according to the description the place they came to should be very comfortable. The guys arrived at the place and saw a dilapidated city, in which it seemed that even ghosts did not live. The guys were shocked at how terrible the place looked. They were literally broken, because they were hoping to finally have a normal vacation. The protagonist thought about the fact that earlier in this city began to rage demon, which was sent to kill as many as 1,000 warriors. It was from that moment the city was nicknamed the mountain where they kill demons. The protagonist paid attention to the old man. Looking at him, he thought about the fact that people started to leave the city, and only a small number of refugees dared to stay in this dreary place. The protagonist knew that many deaths are not the consequences of bad energy, but only a manifestation of the fact that soon the demon will be reborn, and will come to this world again. The protagonist went on, thinking that no one would believe him even if he told them that the merciless demon would soon return. They arrived at their destination, while the servant began to approach the hero with words that the main clan might want them to pay homage to the fallen ancestors. The servant was incredibly frightened, believing that something evil might happen in this horrible place, while the hero did not understand his servant's fear. Suddenly the servant was grabbed by the skeleton's hand, after which he instantly hung his head down, which surprised the protagonist, who reacted very quickly and attacked the skeleton's hand with a dagger, which immediately hit the rope, which he could not cut. The servant was in a panic. He was incredibly badly frightened and begged the hero to help as soon as possible. Suddenly heard human footsteps that moved towards the hero. Suddenly the voice of a man was heard, who was angry that strangers dared to invade their family's ancestral hall. The people were wearing scary masks and asked if the guys wanted to stay in this place forever. The protagonist did not panic and began to explain the situation, namely that he is a member of the Qin family. The man asked if the guy was really from the Qin family. The protagonist confirmed it. He was trying to be polite because this is the home of these people, while the guys were out of anger because they just hated all the Qin family members. The servant was shocked that the opponents became even angrier, while the hero didn't understand why these people were acting like this. The man said that they were thrown out by the Qin family to make peace with the Yi family. Everyone was furious, because it was the Qin family that forced them to survive in this horrible demon-killing city. The man pointed his finger at the protagonist who dared to come to this place to point respect to the fallen people. The protagonist thought about the fact that this group of people really could have been cast out of the family and sent to this place. The protagonist wondered what these strangers wanted to do in the end, while thinking that in the past they had formed a force that was capable of opposing the Qin family. The man asked if the protagonist would dare to fight them. The man started talking about how the losers would become disabled or admit the defeat of their family. He wanted to prove that the Qin family is not only made up of people who like to bully the weak. The protagonist expected such a thing and asked if the men would release his men if he won. The man promised that he would free the protagonist's men, and Feng agreed to the duel. The servant was very worried about his master, as he was only now able to regain his strength, while the protagonist said he could easily defeat these guys. The protagonist said that he could see that the bodies of his enemies were pale and thin, and then he said that he would let his enemies strike first. He said that only those who could strike him would be worthy of battle. The enemies froze in misunderstanding, then instantly started laughing, because the hero's words sounded too funny. The servant could not believe that his master was talking such nonsense, while the hero could not believe that any of these guys could defeat him. Suddenly, one of the men launched a fist attack, and the protagonist only had time to open his eyes. But a moment later he found himself sealed to the concrete by an incredibly strong attack. The servant was shocked at what he saw, for it happened instantly. His enemies rejoiced and considered the protagonist to be an arrogant weakling who was incapable of winning. The man who had struck the blow began to say that they had undergone hellish training, and any master of Qi and blood would die from a single attack. While the servant was shocked by these words, and worried about the protagonist who showed no signs of life, the protagonist was surprised that his opponent was in the body-tempering realm, but he was still alive. Then, with great excitement in his eyes, the protagonist said that he could handle such an opponent. The enemy was surprised that the protagonist was able to laugh after his punch, then instantly appeared in front of the protagonist, saying that he would watch Feng laugh after the battle. Suddenly, the protagonist was able to dodge the enemy's quick attack. Then he began to infuse qi into the stones he had picked up, and attacked the enemy with those stones. The stones fell to the ground while the enemy laughed as he wasn't even hurt, so he assumed that the hero wanted to scratch him. The enemy tried to make an attack while the hero repeated the attack with the stones. Feng laughed at the enemy and asked if it was true that attacks didn't do damage. The enemy couldn't reach the main character, who immediately counterattacked with stones. The man started shouting that the protagonist was a cowardly clown who was afraid to fight for real, just like the rest of the Qin family. The protagonist was smiling because just a moment ago the man was shouting that the protagonist's stones did not do any damage. Then Feng gave a serious look and confessed that now the feeling of pain was going to come. Suddenly the enemy fell to his knees and felt a terrible pain throughout his body. The man couldn't understand how this happened. He didn't understand why he felt weakness in his body. While the other enemies couldn't believe that their older brother had been knocked down by someone who was only at the Qi and blood stage. The protagonist called his opponent an arrogant fool, and then asked if the enemy would fight on or admit defeat. The enemy began to say that he would never admit defeat against a bastard from the Qin family's inner clan. The enemy began to approach the hero with the intention of attacking, while Feng said that the enemy lacked the energy to even strike. Suddenly, the enemy was able to strike, after which he began to rejoice greatly, because he thought he was able to surpass his body. The man noticed that the legs of the protagonist were grabbed, and then he realized that he was able to strike only with the help of another person. The man began to ask his father to let the hero go, because it was not fair and he did not want to win. While the father began to tell him that there was no need for justice in a battle with a member of the inner clan, he also added that the hero was an alchemist who had attacked the man's acupuncture points with stones. He also added that the protagonist was secretly undermining the man's self-improvement, which shocked him. The man couldn't believe that the protagonist was really targeting the man's self-improvement, while the protagonist told the man not to stop, because the fight was still going on. The protagonist started laughing and said that just tapping his feet wasn't enough to defeat him. While the enemy was incredibly angry, he yelled that the hero had come up with a very sneaky tactic and it wasn't right. The enemy was beyond angry. He was saying that the inner clan was full of bastards like the hero. The enemy started to launch an attack with his fist while the protagonist stood still and smiled. Suddenly, Feng was able to jump, after which he was instantly in front of the enemy, after which he grabbed his arm and at a tremendous speed he began to carry out his technique. The protagonist made a powerful kick with his foot, from which the entire floor around began to collapse, as the force of the blow was just at a huge level. The enemy began to cough blood. His eyes turned white, while the man's father could not believe that his iron claws were broken. The servant was incredibly happy, for the protagonist had managed to use the enemy's strength to win this battle. While the enemy was shaking in pain, he kept trying to get to his feet. The protagonist said that the man could not continue the battle, and again suggested that he surrender in this battle. Feng warned that if the battle continued he would simply block the opponent's self-cultivation. The man, on the other hand, with a frantic look, stated that the hero could do whatever he wanted, but he would never surrender to the members of the inner clan. The protagonist, with a smile on his face, said that in that case he would just admit defeat. This shocked absolutely all the people who were in the place. The man started shouting that the protagonist represented the Qin family and by admitting defeat, he was admitting defeat to the Qin family. The protagonist started to say that it was a dispute between them and he can't decide for the whole family. The protagonist added that in any case when one side admits defeat the battle is over, then he went to rescue his men, while the man called the protagonist a shameless man. The guys started to lift their comrade, who was not feeling well. Suddenly the man felt relief in his whole body. It felt as if all his wounds were healed. Suddenly he noticed the stones that were lying nearby. The man had just realized that Feng had used the stones to heal his internal injury. The man watched the protagonist help his man, and realized that Feng had even helped him learn how to use his power properly, and then he had a fit of rage. He thought that in this way the protagonist was trying to humiliate him, because he had not perceived him as a worthy opponent since the beginning of the duel. The protagonist started talking about how they were all part of the Qin family, and then the protagonist got right in front of the man and said that they didn't need to fight to the death as if they were enemies. The protagonist walked up to the monument and then fell on his knees and began to address the ancestors. He promised that he would do his best to make amends for the ancestors' wrongs. The protagonist promised that one day he would restore the family, and there would never again be outsiders in their family. Such words stunned the people who were standing nearby. The man remembered that the Qin family looked at them as weirdos, and mocked them in every possible way. Previously, they were not even seen as human beings and were oppressed in every possible way. Seeing the protagonist, the man realized that all this time he was wrong, and then he began to say that he lost the duel and that now they will not bother the protagonist and his people. Such words amazed the man's father. While the hero thanked him for these words and the servant said that the young master was the best. Suddenly the man received a blow on his back, and it was his father who, while beating the man, ordered to kill the protagonist for him. The man repeated his words that he had lost the duel and was no longer going to fight the protagonist. The old man started yelling that they shouldn't forget what was done to them, and he said that they shouldn't let the protagonist go. The man was taking a lot of blows from his father, but he wasn't going to back down. Suddenly the protagonist intervened and stopped the bat from hitting him. The protagonist said that how the Qin family solves their problems is their business. He asked who gave the old man the right to interfere in this matter. The protagonist, with a creepy look, started talking about how the person who sent him to this place was Qin Dahai's secretary. The old man started saying that he didn't understand who Qin Dahai was, while the protagonist confessed that he had seen the old man in the main clan before, and started saying that he was definitely a member of the main clan who was pretending to be an outsider. The protagonist realized that the old man had deliberately lured him to this place. The protagonist remembered that the material of the chains was royal black gold, which a tramp could not possess. The enemy started shouting that the protagonist had no right to insult him. The protagonist asked if this person dared to stand up to the Qin family, while the enemy couldn't say a word. Suddenly, the old man stopped pretending and was surprised that there was such a smart guy like the protagonist in the Qin family. It turned out that it was really the secretary who was going to defect to the Yi family, and that was the reason why he did so. The old man started yelling that the Qin family was the weakest of the five while the Yi family was the strongest, and he managed to become a member of the Yi family. He started talking in front of all his men that the Yi family had given him a chance. It turns out the condition was to kill the protagonist and provide his corpse at the banquet as a gift, after which he would be allowed to become a true member of the Yi family. The protagonist was amazed that the dog would be so treacherous. The man was shocked that their adopted father had been pretending all this time just to become a member of the Yi family. The old man started yelling that they were all servants of the Yi family and they should be grateful to the family. The old man started saying that anyone who also wanted to join the Yi family should kill the protagonist now. Although the boys were deceived, they realized the benefits of being in the Yi family. The guys started running towards the protagonist with the intention of killing him. All the enemies prepared to kill Feng in the name of the Yi family. The protagonist began to tell the servant that there are ungrateful people, and there are people who are willing to sacrifice themselves for justice, and then the hero began to look gray-eyed and said that it was at this moment woke up the lion, which was a man who looked completely different from how he looked in the battle with the protagonist. The man started screaming with all his might. He was several times bigger than his opponents. The man began to prepare to attack, for even after the truth, these bastards are willing to become the dogs of an outsider. The man was easily able to defeat all of his opponents with literally one attack with his hand. The servant was shocked that the man began to help them. While the hero smiled silently, the old man began to shout that the man was just a dog he had raised and demanded obedience. While the man landed an incredibly accurate and strong punch right on the face of this crazy old man. The old man started flying at a tremendous speed while the man complained that the dog started barking loudly. He started shouting that his last name was Qin and he was a member of the Qin family. Then with a crazy look he started saying that the blood of the victims of the Qin family flowed in his body, and he promised that he would never kneel down and become a dog. The protagonist thought about the fact that as soon as he recognized the group of strangers, he immediately remembered one of these people. It turns out the protagonist knew that the man had incredible talent and strength, and decided to favor him. The man continued to stand in the room, around which the bodies of his kin were lying. Then he turned towards the protagonist with a crazy look, and began to rapidly approach. He looked very terrifying that the servant began to get nervous. He took people's things, then confessed that because of them he now has no place to eat. Then he decided to follow the protagonist because at least so he will have food. The servant was very worried, while Feng said that he saw no problem with the man joining them. The protagonist began to say that if the man would follow him, he would have a bright future, and then they shook hands, cementing the words they had said at that moment. The man said that it was better to starve with the protagonist than to be someone else's dog. while Feng said that they would rejoice together and endure hunger together. Suddenly, the sound of hooves was heard, after which people started talking about all the targets inside, and the order to surround the protagonist and his men was sounded. Feng's gaze immediately changed to the most serious. They were in a huge encirclement, with countless enemy troops beside them. It turned out to be the people from the Yi family. One of the men stood in front of the protagonist and said that it had been a long time since they had seen each other, and warned that they were just conducting an investigation. The bastard began to talk about how they had received a report that a man who had come to fight the outsiders had been defeated and eventually died. The protagonist assumed that the old man was a puppet in the hands of this young enemy, and was well aware that this was the original plan. The guy started talking with a mad expression on his face about how even though the protagonist had a bit of power in his city, he was a nobody in the capital, and that he had the support of the Yi family. Then the guy pointed to the huge number of soldiers behind him, and said that now his influence had no limits. The man was incredibly frightened, because although he could handle one or at most two enemies of such a level, but against such a large number of them, they didn't stand a chance. The enemy soldiers received an order to attack the protagonist, and they immediately began to execute. The protagonist apologized to the man for the fact that as soon as he joined them he immediately faced such a huge problem. The protagonist started shouting that they would never give up and would be able to fight their way out. The man then said that it was no problem as he owed the protagonist a debt of gratitude and promised to do his best. While the servant was shaking with fear, and he said that together with the guys he was not so scared. Then they all said that as members of the Qin family, they would rather die in battle than surrender. Suddenly a clap of hands was heard. It turned out that it was the same old man whom the hero met as he entered the city. The enemy began to call the old man a crazy drunkard, and ordered to kill him instantly. The soldier instantly proceeded to carry out the order, as a moment before he hit, he received a finger attack from the old man, causing him to start flying just at a tremendous speed straight at the guy. He crashed into the young enemy so hard that his mouth began to bleed, and he instantly ordered all the soldiers to protect him and kill the old man. The soldiers instantly surrounded this mysterious old man, and then they started to approach and prepare to attack together. Suddenly the old man swung his arm, causing a huge number of soldiers to instantly be sent flying. Such power shocked the guys because the old man alone could defeat all these mighty soldiers so easily. The old man began to shout that the Qin family would rather die than live. Then he began to say that his family could not be a slave to another family, and confessed that he had been useless for a long time. Then from his weapons began to come out a huge energy, and he confessed that certainly not today he would be useless. A huge symbol appeared in the sky under the old man's words that he would return to the madness of his youth for a while. All the guys were shocked by what appeared before their eyes. It turned out that this old man was holding a battle flag. Together with it he looked as epic as possible. Suddenly the ground began to rattle. It turned out that this phenomenon was due to the soldiers, who moved in the same rhythm. A moment later, all the soldiers bowed to the old man, and lowered their shields. The enemy army was instantly surrounded by a huge number of soldiers. The enemy was incredibly frightened. As this banner called out the entire Qin family army, he could not believe that this had happened. The protagonist was also shocked, because such an item could only get a person who has done great military feats for the Qin family. It turns out that when such an item is used, the entire Qin family army arrives on the spot, and the owner of the item has the right to declare war at that very moment. The protagonist realized that there were only a few people in his family who had this item. He couldn't even imagine who this old man with the battle banner was. While the soldier waited for this old man's order, the old man silently listened as all the soldiers reported that they were completely under the great master's command, then knelt down on their knees. A bird flew in the sky while the soldiers said welcome back to the old man's family. The protagonist was shocked that the old man turned out to be a great master. It turns out that since no one has reached the divine realm, the peak is just the same as the great master who appeared in front of them at that moment. The old man's strength was respected by all the great clans, and he was a level 6 Grand Master, which was incredible. The protagonist didn't understand why the old man decided to appear, since he had disappeared 30 years ago. At that time, the old man began to talk about how when he was young the Qin family was in decline, and in his time there was always fighting between the families. It turns out that 30 years ago he was bullied by the Li family and he went against them on emotion. Although the Yi family was the first to start the conflict, The Qin family was afraid of retaliation and the old man's team was put on trial. Seeing such weakness in his family, he decided that his family was hopeless, and he punished himself by starting to live in this city, after which the old man began to say that today he saw hope in the protagonist. The old man said that today he had seen all of the protagonist's stamina and energy. The old man with a crazy look began to say that he was officially declaring that the lion had awakened and was returning to his family, and then said that he had raised a flag to announce his return. The old man began to talk about how the Qin family should be united, and that they should threaten outsiders and kill each other. He approached the hero and said that although he was once disappointed with the leadership of the Qin family, but after he saw the protagonist, with a smile on his face, he began to say that he saw in the guy the future of the Qin family. The old man held out a flag, then said that perhaps he would leave the protagonist the right to lead the Qin family in the future. Then the old man said that the army would wait for orders from the protagonist, who was holding the flag at that moment. The entire army of the Qin family bowed and reported that they were waiting for the orders of the protagonist. Then they began to repeat the words that they were listening to the orders of the protagonist, while the enemy, seeing such a terrible picture, began to cry, because he realized that with such strength, the hero could easily cut him into pieces. The man was incredibly happy that the protagonist was able to dispose of the entire army of the Qin family, while the hero thought about the fact that the old man decided to give him the army, but he did not realize whether he had the right to do so. The old man began to ask how the protagonist would deal with those who tried to harm him, after which Feng thanked the old man for his trust, and then said that using the banner to fight a bunch of trash is very pathetic, and the old man asked if the guy wanted to let his enemies go. While the enemy started beating his head on the floor, he shouted that the hero was really a merciful man and begged for his life. The protagonist said he didn't want to start a war because of this idiot, but no one said he couldn't torture the enemy. Then the hero with a crazy look started approaching the enemy, saying he had a better way to punish this fool. A while later, in the third prince's mansion, the guy was wondering about the history of the Qin family battle banner, because he was worried that it would scare his men. The prince ordered the man to find out what was really going on as soon as possible. While the girl started crying and begging the prince not to get angry, she said that everything would be fine and asked the guy to postpone the banquet a bit. The guy started reaching out to the girl and then said that the banquet should definitely be celebrated in a big way. He wanted to make this banquet the envy of the whole town. The girl looked as cunning as possible and said that she was not interested in fame and wealth when the prince was with her. He asked the girl not to think so much about others. Suddenly, a man reported to the prince that the Qin family's army had arrived at their place, which shocked the prince. He couldn't believe the report he had just heard. The protagonist's army surrounded the prince's building, who at this moment was out of anger. He assumed that the Qin family army was planning a rebellion against him. The protagonist said that he had come personally to congratulate the prince on his engagement, while the girl could not understand how the protagonist could survive, because she had asked her brother to eliminate him. The prince was angry, and began to say that they did not invite Feng to the banquet, then ordered the hero to get out as soon as possible. The protagonist asked the man not to hurry, then confessed that he did not come empty-handed. The soldiers put on the ground the body of the enemy, which looked just terrible, and the hero announced that it was a gift that the prince cannot refuse. The man was angry, while the girl couldn't believe her eyes. The protagonist started telling the story of how they saved this pathetic guy from the people in the city where he committed the crime. The protagonist began to talk about how if he wasn't allowed to be at the banquet, he would send this guy back to the residence who would definitely do something terrible to him. People were discussing what was happening in front of them, while a girl started yelling that the hero was talking nonsense and that she had asked her brother to come and kill. The protagonist picked up on the girl's words that she had asked her brother to kill someone, which instantly scared her. She didn't know what to say. The girl asked the prince not to complicate the situation and still allow the protagonist to attend the banquet. The man said that if the girl wants it, it will be so. It is in this way the hero with his new friends got to the banquet of the prince and his ex-wife. The prince was very angry to see that people leave dirty footprints behind them, because it defames their banquet. The servant noticed that the prince was angry and asked the protagonist what they should do next. Feng began to tell that he had a short meeting with the prince and his ex-wife, to whom the banquet was enlightened, after which he said with a mad expression on his face that he would make these people remember the banquet for the rest of their lives, while his companions also had creepy facial expressions inherited from the protagonist. A little while later, the wedding banquet itself began. The man began to introduce his beloved to all the people, saying that he loves her more than anyone else in the world. The man began to praise the girl, saying that she will always be by his side, as well as that she swore to be by his side for the rest of her life. The girl pretended to be embarrassed and turned to the prince. People were touched by these words and talked about how good the girl was, while the servant of the protagonist was out of his mind with anger, because this woman was a terrible person who just used men for her own purposes. The protagonist asked the servant to be a little more restrained, while the servant assumed that the protagonist wanted to forgive her. Feng said that they were much better off instead of fighting, a look that suggested that he definitely had some kind of plan in mind. The protagonist stood up and said that he had been friends with the girl since childhood, and also asked for permission to say some warm words. The girl was very worried and said that the guy didn't have to say anything, while the prince said that the protagonist should start talking, because he wants everyone to know what a good wife he has. The protagonist thanked the prince and with a smile on his face asked all the people to listen to him very carefully. The protagonist began to say that when the Lin family was weak, it was the protagonist's family that helped the girl to grow up, and that was the reason why a marriage contract was even made between him and the girl. All the people were shocked that the girl had a marriage contract, even though a moment ago she said she only wanted to marry the prince. At that time, the guys started playing around and pretending as if one of them was the girl and the other was the main character. Feng said that at one point, the girl fell in love with the prince, after which she didn't want to cause trouble. The girl said that an important person fell in love with her, while the protagonist couldn't accept that she wanted to leave him. It was then that the girl attacked the protagonist and tried to kill him. The protagonist revealed that it was at that point that his fighting skills were destroyed, as well as their engagement with the girl who left him. The protagonist began to talk about how he was just a man who made the girl the way she was. He had no right to interfere. All the people were shocked by such words and started to think the girl was ungrateful, while the girl was shocked and thought that the protagonist was being very reasonable when he tried to pretend to praise her and actually laughed at her. The protagonist did a great job of making everyone despise the girl, and that's why he was smiling. The prince started yelling that it's all a lie, and the protagonist doesn't even know what the girl is really like. The protagonist threw some object, then said that even though he may not be taken at his word, he has the thing. The prince caught the thing that the protagonist threw right at him, not realizing what the guy was doing. The protagonist, on the other hand, with a crazed look, stated that the guy would be responsible for the consequences of using it. The prince was mad with anger. It seemed he could explode at any moment. The girl started saying that the guy dared to insult the prince himself, and the prince was going to kill the protagonist and ordered people to arrest him. The soldiers instantly started moving towards the protagonist, with the intention of killing him, while the guy grabbed the flag. Then he put his feet on the table, saying that he loves to brush his teeth with a big toothpick. Then the guy looked at it with his piercing gaze and said it made perfect sense. All the soldiers were immediately startled, after which they instantly bowed down to the protagonist without daring to do anything. People were shocked that the protagonist had a battle banner, which made all the family members bow down. The prince could not believe that the protagonist possessed such an object, and the girl was very frightened. The prince was informed that the protagonist was indeed the new flag bearer of the Qin family, which angered and frightened the prince at the same time. He couldn't believe that the protagonist was actually able to get the banner. The soldier reported to the prince that they could not act recklessly because the great master himself was sitting beside the hero. He also couldn't believe that this uncouth old man could be a great warrior. The prince along with the girl were very much frightened, and the prince was surprised that the uncouth old man was the lord of the Qin family. While the old man asked what exactly the prince had ordered a moment ago, and asked what it could mean, the prince grabbed the mug, then in a trembling voice began to say that he wanted to offer a drink and enjoy the meal together. He realized that there was nothing he could do. The soldier also said that the hero had deceived them about the boy, but the prince ordered the soldier to shut up, because with the power that the protagonist had now, they were not his opponents. The protagonist looked as epic as possible with his new power and the power he had. The girl was shocked, for now her family was a cause for ridicule, and she wanted to gain authority. She vowed to herself that she would not let this all get away from the main character. The protagonist guys praised his skills at pissing people off, while the hero said he wouldn't be too proud, but he was incredibly pleased. Suddenly, One of the soldiers instantly snatched the banner from the hands of the protagonist, then instantly touched his shoulder, then with all his might put the guy on the floor. The guys instantly asked who it was who dared to arrest the owner of the Qin family banner. It turned out that the man in front of them was the head of the Qin clan, who was ordered by the elders to return the banner to the family. He also said that he was going to take the protagonist who had become a traitor to punish him. All the boys were shocked by what they had just heard. A little while later, in the Qin family's law enforcement room, the protagonist was accused of almost starting a war between the clans because of his actions, after which the old man asked if Feng would admit his guilt. The protagonist calmly began to say that he was not the first to attack, but only retaliated. He did not understand how the elders dare to call him a war criminal. The old man began to say that although the hero is brave, it will not help him, because in the end it is not them who will judge him, but the grandmother herself. Thank you so much for watching this video to the end. I really try to work hard on every video, and I would be very grateful if you would support me. Thank you again to everyone who writes comments and likes my videos. I promise that I will continue to try to make videos for you. Thank you all for watching. See you soon.